Sweat dripped down his neck as he lifted another slab of concrete, his once polished hands now raw and bruised. The sun burned through his orange vest, masking the tailored world he came from. Around him, the workers joked, sneered, and whispered, assuming he was just another desperate man needing a paycheck. None of them knew his real name. None of them knew that the company logo printed on their helmets was his father's empire. But when the foreman spat those words, "You people are lucky to have scraps," something inside him began to burn hotter than the noon sun. Before we uncover what happened next, make sure you subscribe to Racism Untold Stories, where real power meets hidden prejudice, and every story reveals the truth beneath privilege. The morning sun cast a golden haze across the towering skyline of the city. It glimmered on polished glass, steel beams, and the marble facades that proclaimed wealth and success. From the top floor of Ellis & Co. Construction, Brandon Ellis looked down at it all through floor-to-ceiling windows that seemed to stretch into forever. Below, the city pulsed with life. Cranes moved like mechanical giants. Workers shouted directions across the noise, and trucks rolled through clouds of dust that never seemed to settle. From this height, everything looked small, clean, efficient, detached. Brandon often wondered if his father, Richard Ellis, had built his company to rise above the dirt he had once come from, or to prove that he could control it. His father was one of the few black men to lead a billion-dollar construction empire. To the public, he was a symbol of perseverance and power, a man who had shattered every barrier placed in front of him. But to Brandon, he was a monument of discipline and silence, a man carved from ambition and iron restraint. Their home reflected the same philosophy. Every line was straight, every surface immaculate. Conversations were measured, polite, and often rehearsed. Love existed, but it wore a formal suit. Brandon had learned early that emotions were to be managed, not expressed. He had gone to elite schools, played golf with other heirs, and interned at companies where diversity was a slogan rather than a truth. On the outside, his life was perfect. Inside, he felt hollow. He had never felt connected to the world his father's company built, the actual ground, the sweat, the people. He had walked through construction sites as a child, holding his father's hand, watching men in hard hats salute respectfully. They looked tired, but proud. His father would often nod at them and say, "They are the backbone of this business." But as Brandon grew older, he noticed something else. Those men rarely appeared in boardrooms. Their names were never mentioned when profits were discussed. They existed in the shadows of success, invisible once the buildings were finished and the cameras arrived. That distance haunted him. One afternoon, during a routine board meeting, Brandon sat quietly at the end of the long mahogany table. The executives were reviewing profit margins and upcoming projects. Cole Matthews, the senior project manager, spoke with confidence. He was tall, white, and sharply dressed, the kind of man who filled every silence with his own importance. He was also the kind of man who called himself an ally, but never looked his workers in the eye. Cole complained about the cost of labor and delays caused by inexperienced hands. He used professional words, but his tone revealed disdain. "Some of the crews lack initiative," he said casually. "You can only train certain people so much." The comment drew faint, uncomfortable chuckles from the room. Brandon's father remained silent, his expression unreadable. Brandon's stomach tightened. He recognized the hidden meaning, the coded language of superiority that so often slipped past unchallenged. It was not direct racism, not the kind that shouted. It was the kind that whispered behind polite smiles and quarterly reports. That night, Brandon lay awake in his penthouse suite. The city lights blinked through his window like distant stars. His mind replayed Cole's words, the hollow laughter, the quiet complicity. He thought about his father's workers, men who stood under the sun for hours, who risked their bodies for a wage barely enough to survive. He realized he had never spoken to any of them beyond a passing greeting. He wanted to understand, not as the son of a CEO, but as one of them. The next morning, he made a decision that would change everything. He went to the company's internal system and found the list of current projects. One caught his attention, a massive urban housing site on the outskirts of the city. It was one of the company's most ambitious builds, managed directly by Cole Matthews himself. Brandon created a false identity using a middle name and his mother's maiden name. He became Marcus Hale. He walked into a thrift store and bought old clothes, a torn jacket, faded jeans, steel-toed boots that had already lived another man's life. He removed his watch, left his phone behind, and stood before his mirror. For the first time, he saw a different version of himself staring back, not the polished air of Ellis & Co., but a man the world would underestimate. The hiring process at the site was quick. A foreman handed him a clipboard without even looking at his face. "We need hands," he muttered. "If you can lift, you are in." And just like that, Brandon entered a world his family had only ever looked down upon. The construction site was alive with sound, the roar of machines, the clang of metal, the rhythmic hum of human endurance. The ground was uneven, coated with dust that stuck to every surface. The air smelled of sweat, oil, and damp cement. Brandon felt the weight of every movement, every glance. The workers were a mix of backgrounds, black, Latino, Asian, white, all bound by the same exhaustion. But he quickly noticed how hierarchy existed even here, unspoken but sharp. The darker-skinned workers were often assigned the heaviest labor. Brandon listened. He observed. He learned. During breaks, he sat on the edge of the scaffolding with the others, sharing sandwiches wrapped in foil. They spoke of rent, bills, families, and dreams that felt just out of reach. Some had been working for Ellis & Co. for over a decade, but still lived paycheck to paycheck. When they spoke of management, they did so with bitterness disguised as humor. One older worker, Darnell, often warned the newcomers, "Do your job and stay quiet. Speak up and you will be gone before Monday." His tone carried experience and defeat. Brandon saw how Cole's visits changed the atmosphere. Whenever Cole arrived in his pristine white shirt and expensive shoes, the laughter stopped. The workers straightened their backs, their faces tightening with forced respect. Cole's eyes moved across them like a man scanning property. He smiled when he wanted something and frowned when reminded that these men were not machines. Brandon began to understand how deeply ingrained the imbalance was. His father's company projected equality in its marketing campaigns, but the ground-level reality was different. Here, power did not wear a suit. It wore a sneer. Weeks passed. Brandon's body hardened, but his mind grew restless. The heat burned his skin, his muscles ached, yet he found clarity in the exhaustion. He began to see dignity in the simplest acts. The way workers helped each other carry heavy beams, the way they laughed despite everything. They built dreams they would never own. Then came the moment that changed everything. Cole and the foreman stood near the gate one afternoon reviewing schedules. Brandon was close enough to hear them. "If these people spent less time complaining and more time working, maybe we would finish early," Cole said. The foreman laughed and replied, "They are lucky they even have jobs, especially the darker ones. No one else would hire them." Brandon froze. The words echoed in his mind, carving through every illusion he had left. He wanted to confront them, to shout, but he swallowed the anger. He was not done observing. Not yet. As he walked home that evening, the city lights blurred in his tired eyes. He thought of his father's speeches about equality and progress. He thought of the awards, the headlines, the image of success. But now he saw what that image had hidden: the cracks in the foundation, the silent suffering that no one at the top ever saw. Brandon understood that this was more than personal curiosity. It was revelation. He had entered the system his father had conquered, only to discover that beneath the success, the old prejudices still breathed. and he vowed that one day soon the world would see what he had seen, the truth buried beneath the dust. The days bled into each other, marked not by calendars but by the ache of muscles and the rhythm of hammer and steel. Brandon woke before dawn, long before the skyline began to glow. He would arrive at the site when the air was still cold and quiet, watching as the workers gathered in silence, faces drawn and tired. As the sun climbed higher, the noise would swell, drills roaring, saws whining, voices rising above the chaos. It was a strange kind of symphony, one built from human endurance and quiet suffering. Brandon had begun to blend in. To the men, he was Marcus, another nameless worker trying to survive. He ate with them, sweated with them, bled with them. He had lost weight, his hands had grown rough, and his once pristine skin now bore the calluses of labor. Yet beneath the dirt and fatigue, his mind burned with purpose. Each passing day revealed another layer of injustice, not overt, but insidious, woven into the daily routines and whispered jokes of those in charge. The foreman, Greg, was a man who smiled when management watched but barked like a dog when they did not. He often singled out the darker-skinned workers for extra tasks. "You are stronger, you can handle it," he would say, but his tone carried mockery rather than respect. The lighter workers, especially those who shared his background, received easier assignments and more leniency for mistakes. Brandon saw Darnell, the older worker, grow more frustrated each week. Darnell had been with the company for over 15 years, but his pay had barely changed. He was skilled, precise, and dependable, yet always overlooked for promotion. When he tried to address it once, Greg told him, "You are lucky to have stability. Some people are not cut out for leadership." Those words echoed through Brandon's mind like poison. He had heard similar phrases in the boardroom, wrapped in corporate polish. Now he saw them for what they truly were. Walls built from prejudice, invisible but unbreakable. Cole Matthews visited often. He arrived in his black SUV, stepping out with an expensive watch glinting in the sunlight. The workers would pause their tasks and straighten their backs. Cole's presence demanded silence. He would stroll through the site, offering fake compliments that felt like insults. "Good progress," he would say, but his eyes would linger on certain faces with subtle disdain. One afternoon, Cole held a meeting near the main scaffolding. He stood before the group with his clipboard, speaking about deadlines and expectations. His voice was smooth, but there was venom beneath it. "If you people cannot keep up," he said, "we will find those who can." You people. The phrase cut through the air like a blade. Brandon saw Darnell's jaw tighten, saw others lower their heads in quiet rage. No one spoke. They could not afford to. The paycheck was survival, and silence was the price. Brandon clenched his fists behind his back. The urge to reveal himself was overwhelming, but he forced himself to wait. He needed proof. He needed to expose not just one man's cruelty, but the rot beneath the company's shining image. Later that week, Brandon witnessed something that hardened his resolve. A scaffolding section collapsed due to faulty materials. 2 workers were injured, both men who had complained days earlier about the weakened bolts. Greg blamed them for carelessness and docked their pay. Cole signed the report without reading it. Brandon knew the truth. The company had cut costs, and lives were the collateral. That night, Brandon could not sleep. His small rented room was dimly lit by a single bulb, the walls cracked and bare. He stared at his reflection in a streaked mirror. The face that looked back at him was no longer polished or naive. It carried exhaustion, anger, and clarity. He realized he could no longer be silent. The next morning, he began to document everything, quietly, carefully. He wrote down the names, the slurs, the unfair firings, the safety violations. He took photos when he could. Each note felt like a brick, building a wall of truth that would one day stand taller than any building his father's company had ever constructed. But the deeper he looked, the uglier the reality became. He discovered that Cole had been inflating project costs and pocketing the difference. Workers were being overworked and underpaid while management celebrated record profits. When one man named Javier refused to work an unsafe height without proper harnesses, he was fired that very afternoon. His replacement arrived the next day, desperate and unaware. Brandon's heart grew heavier. Every injustice, every lie became a weight he carried in silence. Yet he also felt a strange awakening. For the first time in his life, he saw humanity without polish, raw, imperfect, but real. The workers had no luxury, no safety net, but they had loyalty and compassion. They shared meals, patched each other's injuries, and looked after one another like brothers. One Friday evening, as the sun dipped behind the city's skeleton skyline, Darnell sat beside Brandon on a pile of lumber. His face was lined with exhaustion, his hands trembling slightly. "You are a good worker, Marcus," he said quietly. "You do not belong here, but you understand this place better than most." Brandon wanted to tell him the truth, to confess who he was, but the words stuck in his throat. Instead, he nodded. "Everyone deserves better," he murmured. That night, as the workers left, Brandon saw Cole's car parked near the gate. Inside, Cole was speaking to a man from the board. They did not notice Brandon standing in the shadows. Their voices carried through the open window. "The CEO still thinks this site is on budget," the man said. Cole laughed softly. "Let him. The old man has no idea what really happens down here. He is too busy polishing his image. His son will take over soon anyway, and from what I hear, he is even softer." Brandon's blood ran cold. The laughter that followed was sharp, cruel, dismissive, laughter that reduced his father's legacy to a joke and his own existence to weakness. He walked home in silence, every step heavier than the last. He realized that Cole did not just represent prejudice, he represented the corruption that thrived beneath the mask of progress. The next morning, he returned to the site with a new determination. He had gathered enough to expose everything, the racism, the fraud, the exploitation. But he also knew that revealing the truth would not only destroy Cole, it would shake the very foundation of his father's empire. The sun rose over the city as Brandon stood before the half-built structure, its steel skeleton gleaming against the light. He felt both fear and clarity. He knew what had to come next. The truth could no longer stay buried beneath the concrete. The fire that had started in his heart on that first day now blazed uncontrollably. The walls of silence that had protected corruption for years were about to crack. He had walked among the invisible. Now he would make the world see them. And when the reckoning began, no one, not Cole, not Greg, not even his father, would be able to hide behind their polished glass towers again. The morning of revelation began like any other. The sound of drills, the metallic clatter of steel, and the endless rhythm of boots striking concrete filled the air. But beneath that noise, something else pulsed. A quiet storm building in Brandon's chest. The weeks of silence, the months of deception, and the unbearable weight of truth had carved something unshakable inside him. Today, he would no longer be Marcus, the worker. Today, he would stand as Brandon Ellis, son of the man whose name crowned the skyline, and the one who would rip away the veil of false progress his father's empire had unknowingly allowed. The day's heat rose early. The air shimmered above the asphalt, thick with dust. Brandon moved through the site as he always did, steady, unnoticed, invisible. He carried a stack of rebar toward the scaffolding where Cole Matthews stood giving orders, his designer shirt untouched by dirt. Cole barked at a young worker for dropping a wrench, his tone sharp and cruel. "Careless hands build careless futures," he said coldly, glaring at the man's dark skin as if it were proof of inferiority. Brandon stopped mid-step. The words struck a nerve that could no longer remain numb. The same arrogance, the same polished cruelty, the same smile that disguised hate. It was the language of oppression spoken in boardrooms, hidden behind contracts and corporate titles. He had heard it his entire life, but now it felt personal, intimate, cutting, unforgivable. He dropped the rebar. The sound echoed through the site like thunder. Every head turned. Cole's eyes narrowed in irritation. "Pick that up," Cole said, his voice calm but sharp. "This is not a place for theatrics." Brandon did not move. His heartbeat pounded in his ears. The months of observation, the nights spent writing, the faces of men who had suffered in silence. They all converged into this single moment. "No," Brandon said quietly, his voice carrying more power than volume. A murmur swept through the workers. No one ever said no. Not here. Cole's face twisted with disbelief. "Excuse me?" Brandon took a step forward. His chest rose with each breath. His voice steadied. "You should be the one to pick it up. You should understand what it feels like to carry the weight you put on others." Cole laughed, a hollow, humorless sound. "You think this is a speech? You are just another laborer. Know your place before you lose it?" Brandon stared directly into his eyes. "My place," he said slowly, "is wherever the truth stands." Cole's confidence faltered for a split second, but he quickly regained his composure. "Who do you think you are?" The workers stood frozen. The air was heavy with the anticipation of something none of them could name. Brandon's hands trembled slightly, not from fear, but from release. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded document, a printed statement with the company S logo, dated and signed. It was the audit report he had compiled with every note, every photograph, every piece of evidence he had gathered. "Who am I?" Brandon said, his voice rising now, steady and clear. "I am Brandon Ellis, son of Richard Ellis. And this," he lifted the papers into the sunlight, "is everything you tried to hide." The silence that followed was deafening. Cole's face drained of color. His mouth opened, but no sound emerged. The foreman took a step back. The workers looked at Brandon as if seeing him for the first time. The man they had called Marcus now stood like a storm breaking over them. Cole tried to recover his composure. "This is absurd," he hissed. "You think pretending to be one of them makes you a hero? You are a fraud. You are finished." Brandon's eyes did not waver. "No, Cole, you are finished. You used my father's name to build your empire of lies. You stole from the company. You demeaned the men who built it. You poisoned what my father stood for." Cole's face twisted into rage. He stepped closer, his voice low and venomous. "You think anyone will believe you? You are a child playing dress-up in a world you do not understand." Brandon lifted his phone. The screen glowed with a red dot. He had been recording everything since the moment he dropped the rebar, every insult, every lie, every truth. The workers began whispering, realization spreading like fire. "I understand enough," Brandon said. "I understand that you built profit from pain. I understand that these men deserve justice, and I understand that silence is complicity." Cole lunged forward, trying to grab the phone, but several workers stepped between them. Darnell was one of them. His voice, deep and steady, cut through the chaos. "You heard the man. Time you learned respect." The tension snapped. For the first time, the workers stood together, their silence replaced by strength. Cole stumbled backward, his authority evaporating before their eyes. He shouted threats about termination and lawsuits, but no one listened. The power he had thrived on had dissolved into dust. Brandon turned away from him and looked out over the unfinished structure. The rising building seemed to mirror everything he had discovered. Strong on the surface, but weak within. He felt a swell of anger and sorrow, but also something purer. Clarity. By the afternoon, word had spread. Brandon sent the evidence directly to his father, and to the board of directors. The documents revealed everything: the wage manipulation, the safety violations, the embezzlement, the discrimination reports that had been buried. When Richard Ellis arrived at the site later that day, the ground seemed to hold its breath. The workers stepped aside, watching father and son face each other amid the skeleton of steel and stone. Richard's eyes, usually calm and unreadable, were stormy. Brandon stood before him, dirt covering his clothes, truth burning in his hands. He said nothing at first. He simply held out the file. His father took it, opened it, and read. The silence between them was heavier than any noise. Finally, Richard looked up. His voice was low. "You did this?" Brandon nodded. "I had to see what your empire was built on, and I found both greatness and rot." His father's gaze softened, though pain lingered in it. He turned to face Cole, who stood several feet away, pale and trembling. Richard's voice, when it came, was thunder. "You are done here. Every man you have ever disrespected will hear your apology before you leave this site. Then you will face the board and the law." Cole's shoulders collapsed. He said nothing. Brandon looked around at the men who had worked beside him, their faces a mix of shock, gratitude, and disbelief. For years, they had been unseen. Now, for the first time, they were witnesses to justice. As the sun began to set, Brandon stood atop the foundation of the building. The wind carried dust across the site, golden in the fading light. He felt lighter, but also aware of the long road ahead. The system was bigger than one man, but truth had to start somewhere. He looked down at his hands, scarred, raw, human. These hands had carried weight, built walls, and torn them down. And for the first time in his life, Brandon Ellis truly felt alive. He had exposed hypocrisy. He had faced corruption. He had reclaimed his name. But more importantly, he had found his purpose. The empire would never be the same again. The site was quiet the morning after the confrontation. The air still held the scent of dust and concrete, but it felt different, lighter, cleansed of the tension that had hung like a dark cloud for months. Workers arrived cautiously, eyes flicking toward Brandon and his father, uncertain of what had changed and what would remain the same. For years, this place had demanded silence, obedience, and endurance. Now, for the first time, they sensed something they had forgotten existed: respect. Brandon moved among them slowly, noticing the subtle shifts. Darnell met his gaze, nodding with a mixture of pride and relief. Others whispered quietly, as if afraid that acknowledgement might be dangerous. But the atmosphere had shifted irrevocably. Words like injustice and betrayal had been spoken and validated. Truth had surfaced, and it carried weight heavier than any steel beam. Richard Ellis stayed close to his son, observing the men whose sweat had built his empire. He had always believed in diversity, in opportunity, in merit, but he realized that leadership without daily awareness was blind. He had celebrated success from boardrooms high above the streets and scaffolds, unaware of the silent suffering his empire had tolerated. Today, he had seen it, felt it, and could no longer ignore it. Brandon had prepared for this moment. Over the past weeks, he had compiled an exhaustive report of every injustice, every discrepancy, every act of subtle discrimination. He distributed copies to the workers and the board, ensuring transparency and accountability. There were gasps, disbelief, and even tears. For some, validation was a release they did not know they needed. For others, it was anger finally transformed into action. The board acted swiftly. Cole Matthews was removed immediately. Greg, the foreman who had enforced petty prejudices, was suspended pending investigation. Policies were rewritten. Compensation and safety protocols were corrected. But beyond administrative measures, a deeper change began, a cultural reckoning. Brandon did not retreat to comfort after the exposure. He stayed on the site for weeks, walking beside the men, lifting beams, mixing cement, and sharing meals. He listened to their stories, their dreams, their fears. He learned names, histories, families, and struggles. The empire he had inherited suddenly felt human, fragile, and beautiful, not because of profit margins, but because of the people who had built it with their labor, their dignity, and their persistence. He began holding weekly meetings with the workers, not from a podium, but seated at their level, listening and validating. Decisions were discussed openly. Raises and promotions were no longer decided by favoritism or coded prejudices. Recognition went to skill, commitment, and integrity. Trust, which had eroded over decades, began to rebuild brick by brick. The transformation did not go unnoticed. Local media began to cover the story, highlighting the young heir who had risked everything to expose injustice in his own company. Headlines praised his courage, but the men Brandon worked beside knew the truth was more complicated. It was not heroism. It was justice long overdue. It was humanity reclaimed. Brandon also witnessed the ripple effect on the workers' personal lives. Families began receiving fairer pay, children could attend school without parents worrying about the next paycheck, and community trust in corporate leadership was cautiously restored. For the first time, the invisible backbone of construction, the men and women who built the city, were seen. Truly seen. The emotional impact on Brandon himself was profound. His polished, privileged life had felt hollow before. Now, every calloused hand, every dirt-streaked face, every smile born from exhaustion taught him something real. He had entered the site seeking understanding, but he had found purpose. He had found the value of presence, empathy, and the courage to act when others might turn a blind eye. Richard Ellis, watching his son walk among the workers, felt pride deeper than any award or accolade. Not because Brandon had revealed Cole's hypocrisy, but because he had embraced the responsibility that came with leadership. Legacy, he realized, was not wealth, not power, not titles. Legacy was ensuring that those who built the empire were treated with dignity and fairness. Yet the lessons extended beyond the construction site. Brandon began to speak publicly, not as a privileged CEO's son, but as a man who had witnessed the real consequences of systemic inequality and racial bias. He spoke of fairness in business, respect for labor, and the silent struggles of those society often overlooked. His speeches resonated because they were authentic, rooted in lived experience, not theory. Brandon never forgot the first time Cole spat words of disdain at the workers. He remembered the fear, the humiliation, the resignation in their eyes. But now, he also remembered their resilience, their unity, and their unwavering humanity. He realized that the people he had once thought were beneath him were the very ones who carried the world on their shoulders. And in standing beside them, he had finally understood his father's vision. Not as a distant observer, but as a participant in the reality of life itself. The construction site began to hum with a new energy. Orders were still given, deadlines were still met. But the tone was different. Laughter returned naturally, not forced, and pride replaced resignation. Brandon often paused to watch the men work together, their movements synchronized in quiet mastery. The empire that had once been built on walls and glass now felt grounded, real, alive. Months later, the building was completed. The structure gleamed, but it carried a different significance now. It was more than concrete and steel. It symbolized accountability, respect, and the courage to confront uncomfortable truths. Brandon stood on the finished floor, overlooking the city skyline. The same skyline he had once viewed from a distance, untouched and detached. Now, he saw it through the lens of empathy and justice. He thought of the moral he had learned. Sometimes those we overlook, those we dismiss, carry the very truth that can save us. Sometimes the weight of injustice is carried silently, until someone chooses to acknowledge it. And sometimes, Courage is not inherited. It is awakened in the moments when silence is no longer an option. As the sun set, Brandon felt the warmth of purpose fill him. He had exposed hypocrisy, elevated the invisible, and restored dignity to those who had been silenced. Yet, he also understood that change was never complete. Systems required constant attention, compassion required constant action, and justice demanded unwavering vigilance. He turned to the workers around him, who had come to see the building finished, their pride shining through exhaustion. He felt the enormity of what had been achieved together, a community transformed by acknowledgement, accountability, and courage. And he knew one truth above all: the world would not always be fair, but it could be better if people chose to see, to act, and to lift those who had been pushed down. Would you have treated them differently? Would you have risked comfort to confront injustice? Sometimes the ones we ignore are the ones who carry the truth that could change everything. If this story moved you, make sure to subscribe to Racism Untold Stories. Join us as we uncover hidden truths, confront injustice, and share the untold stories that demand to be heard. Every story matters, and your awareness can make the difference.